Well, as we get closer to Election Day, understanding the policy plans of both candidates is going to be very important. The Penn Wharton Budget Model has taken a deeper dive on both Vice President Kamala Harris's plans as well as those of former President Donald Trump. And pleasure to be joined by Kent Smetters, who's faculty director of the Penn Wharton Budget Model, joining us as well as professor of business economics and public policy at the Wharton School. Kent, great to talk to you again. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me back on.
All right, so I guess let's start out with the collection of this information, because I think it's also important to understand that, because we're at a point right now where it feels like we're just learning a lot about what each candidate is potentially going to bring forward.
That's right. In particular, they're very different in some sense that Trump, we kind of know what he wants. It's very clear. It's also very expensive because he doesn't have any way of right now paying for it. So add a lot of debt to the picture on a path that already is exploding with federal debt. Whereas in the case of Harris, the problem there is that they've released an official campaign document, but then they're having these kind of side conversations and giving some hints about how they'll pay for some of this stuff, but it's not very organized at all. And so, we and the Joint Committee on Taxation, CBO in particular, are pretty consistent that you have to give us details. We're not going to give you freebies in terms of revenue and things like that. So her package is much smaller, but it does also increase the debt.
So I think when you talk about former President Trump, there are certain things you said that we can kind of assume would probably come into play. One being the extension of the 2017 tax cuts and what kind of impact those would have.
That's right. In particular, just extending those tax cuts, and they mainly focus on the individual side. The business side, most of those were already permanent, although some of those would have otherwise expired as well, but mostly on the individual side. And the extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we're talking about over $4 trillion of additional debt over the next decade. And so it's pretty expensive. But then what he's added on to it is reducing or in fact even eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits, and as well as lowering the corporate tax rate even more from 21% to 15%. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act already lowered it from 35% to 21%. Now he wants to take it one step further. And so altogether, that's about $5.8 trillion of additional debt over 10 years. If you allow for economic feedback effects, and he does get some positive feedback effects during the first part of the decade, and then he loses it toward the end of the decade. But the cost would be about $4.1 trillion, whereas Harris is working much the opposite way.
Yeah, as for Vice President Harris, she has seemed to show some support for some of the ideas that President Biden has been wanting to put into play, like raising taxes on the higher end of the population, and even the potential of raising the corporate tax rate.
Yeah, what she stated officially, and this was in their campaign proposal, is that she would raise the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%. That definitely raises some money. It's about $1.1 trillion over 10 years, but also has a negative effect on the economy. And then she has some other things that she wants to do, including with the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and continuing what's called premium support for the Affordable Care Act, which is already subsidized. She would subsidize it even more, and then down payment for first-time home buyers. And so overall, we estimate her entire package would be about $1.2 trillion on a conventional basis. But when you allow for economic feedback effects, it would cost it would raise deficits by about $2 trillion. Now, what the Harris campaign has done in light of some of these numbers is that they are having these side conversations. They're telling, one reporter asked them, well, do you not stand by the Biden-Harris fiscal year 2025 budget? And the Harris campaign has said, yes, we agree with that budget. And so some reporters are saying, oh, therefore, you should include all the tax increases in that budget as what we call pay for as revenue raisers. Mm-hmm. But then what about all the spending in that budget that she hasn't talked about yet? then suddenly walk away from those. And so we can't just take one part based on one comment and not the other part. Presumably she agrees with the entire budget, but she needs to confirm that. And then the campaign's also said some things like they're open to extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but only for people making less than 400,000. If that were the case, that would be a big additional spend right there. And so ultimately, we have to be disciplined, and we can't just be rumor chasing. We have to say, this is what the campaign said, this is what they've actually released, and that's what we're going to look at. We're not going to give, fake money. We're not going to give, just free money so that the score can look better.
There's also discussion, and I don't know if this is put into the dynamics of what you looked at with the Harris campaign, about the potential of taxing unrealized capital gains.
Yeah. And that is part of the President Biden fiscal year 25 budget. And we as the Penn Wharton Budget Model and the Joint Committee on Taxation are the only ones that do a kind of full analysis of the president's budget every year. We release ours in May. Usually the JCT will come out in late fall with their analysis. And in particular, both JCT and us agree on one thing, and that is this particular tax that the president has talked about, which he also included in the fiscal year 2024 budget. That's about the only thing we refuse to score. And the reason is that there's no details about it. What has been released really is not coherent at all. They call it Billionaire Tax. It's not even actually focused on billionaire. And I think the reason why they want to kind of shy away from it is they don't want to have the conversation about, like, if your parent owns a business, and that how is that privately held business going to be evaluated every year? You're going to need some government agency to agree on the valuation of that business. And then how are they going to pay taxes on the unrealized gains on that business where they're not liquid? So are they going to give shares of that business to the government? Then how does that regulation come about? Because unless it's SEC registered, that would be very challenging. So the Trump administration played games with the budget. The Biden administration plays games with the budget. This is definitely one way they're doing it, in the sense that they want to take a revenue from it. They say they got from Treasury doing the estimate. We have no idea how they could have possibly come up with that number. There's no details. But at the same time, they'd never want to talk about it in any type of detail as well, because it would lead to all these sorts of issues.
How much can you correlate the potential cutting of taxes in certain areas? Like, let's use the Social Security component as the example here, of seeing the cut in taxes there, and what that would mean potentially for growth. Obviously individuals having a little bit more money in their pocket. Yeah.
So there's definitely ways that you can use a dollar deficit to stimulate growth. And then there's ways that it just doesn't stimulate growth. And in fact, it does the opposite by adding more debt. That reduces private investment. So let's take an easier example. Let's say the corporate income tax. Those on the far right are going to say, whenever you reduce the corporate rate, it always pays for itself. Well, that mathematically can't be true, but in fact, it's not even close to be true. You definitely lose revenue, which we estimate in the case of the Trump reduction. On the other hand, those on the left who say, the corporate rate has no impact on the economy. And of course, that's absolutely not true either. Something in the middle is definitely more true in the terms of the corporate rate. In the case of Social Security benefits, not taxing that's going to have very little effect on the economy. Yes, it's going to leave a little bit more money in people's pocket for consumption, but that's not the main growth part or the growth engine of the economy. That's not the main growth factor. The main growth factor is actually stimulating investment. That's the thing that gives you these compounded returns over time, and that is reducing the taxes on benefits. It's definitely not going to do that. And so I think it is one of those things that it's mostly debt causing, mostly crowding out private investment, very little stimulus in terms of new investment. And whereas the corporate rate tax, it at least has more stimulus in terms of investment.
Can you also start to think about when you're doing assessments like this, with some of the components that each candidate would want to bring about, the component of Congress and passing some of these bills, and
Yeah.
whether or not they're not even realistically factors in the mix moving forward because of the congressional makeup. Obviously, we won't know more about that until the November election, but obviously with some of these policy plans, it does become a factor.
That's right. And in particular, the scoring process or even the economic distributional analysis or the economic growth analysis always has to be done under an as-if condition.
Right.
In particular, we can never just say, you know what, we don't think this is realistic, so therefore we're only give it 30% weight. Why would it be unrealistic? Maybe it's because under the as-if condition, as though it were done, Congress says we don't want to do that because of the as-if. And so like any accounting exercise, we have to just say, suppose those were done, what would the impact be? Now, otherwise you get these circular arguments very, very quickly, and will also put us in the role of playing politics. But it is true that how a bill gets passed can sometimes materially impact things. For example, one thing is regulation. Is the federal government just using regulation to get something done? That could be scored a little bit differently than if they didn't use regulation, or if they are passing something as what's called budget resolution, subject to the Byrd rule, versus not using that, but having a true tax bill, which could be subject to a filibuster.
So I'll wrap it up here. I mean, looking at the data that you've collected for both candidates right now, what do you think are the most important takeaways from the numbers we see so far?
Yeah, everybody wants to focus on the relative. Who's better? I think that's missing the big picture. The big picture is one of this explosive debt path right now, and that is going to eventually accumulate in the form of some type of major problem, either sharp increases in taxes in the future, sharp decreases in spending, or if those don't get done, sharp increases in inflation. We've had this experience with higher than normal inflation. We can get back to 2% inflation for a few years, but if Congress doesn't do anything, the only thing that can be done is to monetize the debt. And so you could be talking about 4 or 5% inflation going on for a couple of decades is one of the realistic outcomes. So that's the current law. Both candidates are doing the same thing. They're adding to that debt. They're both going to contract the economy. And then on top of that, here's what's they're both missing, is that we are in a position right now where we could actually bring down debt while actually growing the economy. And on the Penn Wharton Budget Model website, we have 3 different major options. We don't call them liberal, conservative, and moderate, but essentially that's what they are, bundles 1, 2, and 3. And there are definitely ideas that are consistent with each kind of worldview out there that can bring down debt while actually grow the economy. But it requires making tough choices, and neither candidate is really willing to do that.
Ken, always great to get your thoughts and your insight. All the best, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You got it. Ken Smetters, who's professor of business economics and public policy here at the Wharton School, and also faculty director of the Penn Wharton Budget Model.